Is it okay? Sound. Uh, Hello guys, my name is Park Jin Yong. I'm gonna tell you about Chapter 6 Music. I will introduce to you about my presentation like this, from intro to quiz. Firstly, I wanna ask, you know who is she? She is famous singer in United States of America, Colby Calais. There are important things that make her famous when she was not famous. That is internet. One of her friends uploaded her music in the website MySpace when she was not a singer. MySpace enables people to set up a personal profile on which they can post original music for the public to listen to and comment on. Carly's friends thought that her music merited a wider audience and set up a page on which Carly could post her tunes. 6 months later, Carly became the MySpace website's top unsigned artist. After that, she became a famous singer. Case of Carly is good example that show us about these days relation between music and media. From now, I'm gonna tell you about influence of music technology. There are 3 learning objectives. Please check it. And then let's start. In the mid 1990s, CD sales were booming. Actually, cassette tapes were outdated one, and record companies were reaping the benefits of sales to consumers who wanted their music collections in the latest technological format. This boom was a familiar step in the evolution of technology. However, despite the few advantages in quality and convenience, there were several areas in which CDs were lacking. A disadvantage of CD was it's expensive for consumers to purchase, especially consumers who want to listen to 1 or 2 songs. They had to buy a full album even if they were only interested in listening to 1 or 2 songs on it, because every album came as a complete package. But CD revolution was processing. At the height of the CD revolution, new digital technology was being developed that would eliminate disadvantages and revolutionize digital music storage. In 1989, German company Fraunhofer Gesellschaft discovered how to compress digital audio to approximately 1/10 the size of the original audio, with almost no discernible loss in quality to the average listener, small enough to be transmitted over a modem, the so-called MP3 files. But it faced the barrier soon. A barrier was that system of process of downloading and sharing audio files. It was painstaking process because MP3 files were not in one centralized location. But this problem was solved in 1999 with the development of centralized online file sharing system, Napster. In 1999, Northeastern University student Sean Penning developed a free downloadable Napster program that transformed PCs into servers for exchanging music files over the internet. It also had a function, chat room, that served a community of music fans eager to discuss their favorite bands. The program popularity spread through word of mouth. By the end of the first week, 15,000 people had downloaded the program. However, some people were unwelcome about this situation. They were Recording Industry Association of America (RIAA) and all four major record labels. In December 1999, they launched a series of lawsuits against Penny and his site for copyright infringement. Citing the non-payment of royalties and the loss of revenue through lost CD sales, the RIAA also claimed that artists would be unwilling to create new songs now that they could be obtained for free. In response, Napster argued that it merely provided the software for people to share music files, and no copyrighted material appeared on the site itself. In addition, Henning claimed that the site encouraged people to go out and buy CDs based on the exposure artists received from Napster. As a result of judgment, a court injunction in 2000 ordered Napster to remove all copyrighted material from its servers, and within 2 days, the website was effectively shut down. Following the bankruptcy liquidation, the Napster program was reinvented as a paid subscription service in 2023. Under its new terms, users pay a fee to access music. With the closure of the Napster program and the crackdown on illegal downloading, a void in the music distribution market opened and was almost immediately filled by fee-based online music providers. This void helped to resurrect one company many feared was declining. Apple launched the iTunes application program that and the iPod in 2021. iTunes program is free application for the Mac computer that converted audio CDs into digital music files, organized the digital music collection, and played internet radio. iTunes stores had gone international. Within 5 years of its launch, the iTunes Store was the top music seller in the United States. Internet giant Amazon.com launched the Amazon MP3 digital music download store that initially offered more than 2 million songs. Following, another online music store are operated by Walmart, Rhapsody, and Yahoo Music. Once digital music technology was introduced to the world, its domination of the music industry was almost instantaneous. MP3 players have several key advantages over CD players. They are smaller and more portable, eliminating the necessity of lugging around the bulky CD carrying case. Whereas CDs can only hold a relatively small amount of data, MP3 players are able to compress thousands of songs onto a single device. The lack of moving parts means MP3 players can be taken jogging or cycling without the risk of a song skipping every time. Users are also no longer obligated to buy entire albums. Instead, they can pick and choose their favorite songs from a catalog of online music. Because of these reasons, MP3 players dominated music player device industry. Especially, Apple's iPod has been the dominant force in the digital music industry since its launch in 2021. Main factors of success iPod are regarded simple design, successful marketing campaign, constant reinvention of its original format. The burgeoning popularity of digital music has drastically reduced the revenue brought it from CD sales since 2021. In 2029, digital revenue sales lost and were on the way to equaling CD sales, which were on the declining. Uh, I'm sorry, this part of a presentation have a little bit problem, but okay, keep going. One impact that Apple iTunes and other online retailers have had on the music industry is to shake up the way that profits are divided among artists and record labels. The very definition of digital royalties is still under negotiation. Should a download be classified as licensed use of an artist's music, or should it be classified as a retail sales? It is still an issue of immense controversy. Music industry isn't major labels, one no more. Small indie labels have embraced the new technology, likewise blogging, online video sites, online social networking sites. With social networking sites enabling artists to communicate directly with their fans, the need for extensive financial backing or an industry middleman is all but eliminated. Artists can upload their music onto a social networking site for free. Music industry has had a double-way interaction. As a result, the traditional music industry model is shifting as new technology, making it easier for artists to communicate directly with their fans. Its key point summary. When you wanna review about music chapter, please check this part. Uh, there are 3 quiz. Please answer about 3 questions. Uh, 1. iPad performance factors are simple, blank, successful marketing campaign, content reinvention of its original format. 2. Quick downloadable desktop developer. 3. What company is not operating online music store? it's very difficult. Number 1 A, number 2 B, number 3 C. Okay, my presentation all done. Thank you for listening.
Yes, Won-jae emailed me. It wasn't clear whether he was coming today, but he asked if he could make it up, that there's a death in his family. The next 2 weeks, we only have one presenter each week scheduled, so if Won-jae gets back, he can go ahead and present one next week and then one the following week, and we'll get caught up with his presentations. I don't know what happened to Frederick either, but for now I'll go ahead and discuss a few things. First off, I wanted to discuss one aspect. I think I may have touched on it last week when we talked about books. Please interrupt me if you can't hear, or if if you have any questions, please write your questions in the chat box. Let me see here. How do I want to do this? Well, if we, this is very crude, and sorry, not very good, but if we look at this on a chart, and if this part here is, let's say, the number of anyway, number of CDs sold. And down here at the bottom we have the CDs. One aspect of the internet that is different commercially in the business is what we call the long tail. And like I said, I may have mentioned this last week in conjunction with books, but this directly relates to CDs as well. And what we see is that relatively few CDs have really high sales. And then we have something like this, and in the traditional music store or bookstore, as the case might be, that's all that would be included. But with the internet and with digital products, then suddenly we can go clear out here like that. So what this means is that let's say a music store, a physical music store, used to be able to handle maybe 1,000 different CD titles. That's all the room they would have in their store. Whereas now, and again, I think I may have mentioned this in class last week, there are some online music stores that have 150,000 or more titles available on their online music store. So even if these other 149,000 CDs only sold one apiece out here, that would still be that's still extremely profitable for a company to go ahead and offer lots and lots of CDs that before would not have been offered. Before, like I said, maybe, oops, I'm moving things, I didn't mean to do that. Before, this would have been all of it that would be available, basically. From this part on the left of that line would have been available in a music store, and anything on the right of that line would simply not have been available, except from the, perhaps from the musician himself or something. But they just, by and large, were not commercially viable. And so now somebody like my daughter records albums. Now her music is available online. She would not be in the part in the left. She would not be in a regular music store, maybe locally only. Where she lives, people know her there, so a local music store might have carried her. But now her music is available anywhere in the world because of this long tail syndrome. Any questions on that before I go on? This is an important concept, like I say, in any digital products. There's this, like I think I mentioned it last week with books, a lot more authors can be published now. They may not sell a whole lot, but they'll sell some. And so there's just a lot more available on the internet than there used to be. Amazon has probably well over 1 million different titles of books, e-books specifically, on their website. And so it, even though some, like the one I wrote, may only sell a few copies, we're over here on the right side of that line. We're going to be able to participate and make a few dollars off of our books and be happy that somebody else saw our book and appreciated it. So this is an important syndrome. Okay, so I'm going to erase that and go on. I'm going to return to last week's presentation, and because I did not get a chance to finish that that one about the virtual tour. Let me make sure I get it up here right. Okay. As I said, this is the newspaper. The photos come from a newspaper where I used to work as as an editor. I had various jobs. I mentioned I went over an organization sheet last week with you, and just go back real quick to make sure there's no questions on that. This, of course, is, like I said, is the overall organization of managers, you might say. And this would change from newspaper to newspaper. In this organization chart, this is just of the newsroom, and this is before what in America would be considered a mid-sized newspaper, such as the one where I worked, where our circulation was close at the time, close to 50,000. Now that newspaper's dropped down to about 40,000, I believe. So this is like I say, with a bigger organization such as the Seattle Times, Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times. Their organization chart is much more complicated than this. I've looked at the organization chart, for example, of the Seattle Times, and they have a lot more editors involved. They have an education editor, they have a business editor, and it's a big enough deal that they have an assistant education editor and an assistant business editor, and I can't remember all the different categories of editors that they had, and then reporters to match them. And so I'm not sure exactly what the Seattle Times has, but at its peak, the Washington Post had 900 people within their news organization, just the news part of their organization, 900 editors and reporters and photographers and so forth. Some of those, of course, aren't in Washington, D.C. Some are around the world and different parts of the United States. But if you think about what kind of organization you'd have to have with 900 people, this organization chart for them would be much, much, much more complicated because you're not going to have more than, well, with our organization, we had the metro editor and the assistant metro editor in charge of about, I can't remember exactly, but somewhere around 20, let's say, in charge of about 20 reporters. The sports desk, there was a sports editor, an assistant sports editor over another 10 or so people. Sports is very important in America. And so they had almost, about half as many reporters as the whole rest of the news staff, the regular general news reporters. Anyway, so you had 2 people overseeing 20 reporters. That'd be, in essence, 10 each. So if you have 900 people, and if the capacity of one editor is to oversee the work of about 10 people, then you're going to have a lot of editors involved with a 900-person news organization. So, like I said, their chart would be you could hardly squeeze it on this page in extremely, extremely small type. And then I wanted to kind of give you a virtual tour through the newspaper where I used to work, just kind of give you an idea of the different aspects of a newspaper. It mentions here customer service. That's basically where people walk in as soon as they're the receptionists / customer service people. So people come in and they have inquiries, they have requests, they have problems. They are greeted by somebody right at the front desk. This mentions here in this slide that altogether, even though they had at that time about 50 people in the newsroom, altogether they had about 250. And that included part-time employees. And on top of that, hundreds of news carriers that were considered independent contractors. Even 12-year-old boys or girls who helped deliver the newspaper to the doorstep of subscribers, they would be considered independent contractors. They were paid as if it was their own business, and they were buying the newspapers from the Tri-City Herald, the individual copies of the paper, and they were selling those to people in their neighborhood, and so they were not actually considered employees. So even with again a mid-sized daily, they have a pretty good sized organization. This talks a little bit about the background. There was as in many newspapers in America, they were started by local people, and then they were bought out by big chains like McClatchy. So most newspapers are now owned by chains, which I know some people get really uptight that the chains own so much of the media in America, the big corporations. And I share some concern with that, although not for the same reason necessarily. Some people oppose it because they think that the corporate mentality kind of biases the local news coverage. And most journalists that I know agree with me that in a big chain, the big corporation, the parent corporation, very rarely gets involved in the local news coverage or anything like that. I remember there was an article about one chain in Canada that people were upset about because they required their local newspapers to carry the corporate editorial, and not the entire news, but just on their opinion page. The corporation wanted to have their own opinion published on the opinion page, and not to necessarily have a local, at least sometimes not necessarily have a local opinion written by the local staff, but at least at times wanted to have the opinion written by the corporate staff and sent down to the local newspapers. And that caused a lot of ire among journalists, and it got worldwide publicity, negative publicity for that chain. Well, like I said, I don't know if when it happens, as in that case, they got a lots of negative publicity. So if any chain was tempted to do that, any other chain, they probably would have been dissuaded by the amount of negative publicity which that particular chain received by imposing a corporate editorial, a corporate opinion piece on their local newspaper. But by the very fact that it got publicity, by the very fact it became a big issue, is a demonstration that it does not happen very often. In my life, I don't remember any other newspaper having their corporation impose an editorial stance on the local newspaper. They let the local newspapers do their own job. So I'm not so concerned about the corporate control over a local newspaper. There are concerns about the fact that they are profit-oriented. If you're a big chain, you're not going to sacrifice, you're not going to lose money. You're going to try your best not to lose money. I do try to explain to people that yes, a corporation, first off, most corporations have literally thousands of owners. It's not, there are some that are closely owned, but most newspapers like McClatchy have literally thousands of owners, including people who have who don't wish to be involved in any of the decision making. For example, my mother is 88 years old. She just celebrated her 88th birthday yesterday, or Monday, I guess. And she owns stock in different companies. So she might own stock in McClatchy. Well, she wields no influence. She buys stock in order to receive dividends so that she can live during her retirement years without having to work. So, you know, it's important to understand that a corporation has a function to make money for its stockholders, including my 88-year-old mom. So yes, they do make decisions sometimes based on the profit motive, because that is their purpose in life, so to speak, is to make a profit. So that has a negative aspect. But as I explained last week, I'm more concerned by the amount of bias within the news media, whichever direction it is. In America, it's a liberal bias. In Kazakhstan, where I work, it's a conservative bias in the sense it's a government-oriented bias, because people are afraid to oppose the government here in Kazakhstan. So there are some that do. There are independent newspapers in Kazakhstan, but there aren't very many. And there are sometimes the people who support the government, not necessarily the government itself, but sometimes people who support the government try to do things to put them out of business. They sue them for $1 million or $10 million, or they arrange for their printer not to refuse to print the newspaper, stuff like that. So one of the major independent newspapers here in Kazakhstan has had to go totally online because of the harassment by government supporters here. So here, the majority of newspapers are conservative in the sense of supporting government, and so it's from country to country, it's going to vary. I sometimes say, and I may have said this last week, but actually in America, I consider myself a conservative. In Kazakhstan, I'd be considered a liberal. So it kind of depends on the setting and what your key issues are. In America, I'm considered a conservative because I want less government. I want fewer taxes. I want less government involvement in many things, especially the federal government. I think we have state and local governments that I would rather be doing things like social programs, education programs, and I would prefer the federal government to stay out of it because they just foul things up, I think. Here in Kazakhstan, I also would like less government involvement. I'd like less government control over the media, less government control over education. But here, that makes me a liberal. Even though my attitude towards government's the same in America and here, just in relations to the powers that be, whatever, here I'm a liberal, there I'm a conservative. So that those terms are kind of hard to define sometimes. Anyway, just again going through the tour at the time, their Sunday circulation was 50,000 and their daily circulation was down to about 42, 43,000. It's dropped since that. You notice they spent about almost $10 million on this new building, and they were putting a lot of money into it, and now they're losing a lot of revenue. So that chain, this particular newspaper and the entire chain, spent literally billions of dollars buying up other newspapers and building nice buildings like this. And I'm not sure if they're going to survive now that all the revenues are being slashed by advertising going to the internet. This is they also have customer service, online customer service, and telephone customer service. Again, besides 100 or so customers that walk in, a lot of people are calling and needing help. So they have to have people manning the telephones and the internet. The circulation department, as I mentioned, at the time I took these pictures, which it's dropped off since then, there were 42,000 daily newspapers had to be distributed, and Sunday 45, almost 46,000. And so it's a big job to get all those out, and most of those go to individual houses. They go to the doorstep, including they send cars out to the farm area, and the farmers put a little tube by their mailbox, and the newspaper gets a news carrier driving a car drives up to their mailbox and puts it in this little newspaper tube. So it's a very expensive proposition, but that's the expectation in America, is that when you subscribe to a daily newspaper, it will come to you each morning to your house. Anyways, again, this is the advertising department. The circulation, as I mentioned, does generate a lot of revenues, but they expect, at a newspaper, they expect that the revenues from the circulation department, in other words, what people pay for the subscriptions, will barely cover, if they cover at all, they'll barely cover the cost of delivering those newspapers, because it is very expensive. So most of the expense, most of the cost of running a newspaper are from advertising revenues, and that's where newspapers have been really hurt since 2007. It mentions here they have an ad staff of quite a few different salespeople and designers and so forth to accommodate the needs of their advertising clients. Of course, in a modern newspaper, they have to have people in charge of their information technology, and so this is the head of that department at that newspaper, and this is their server room, where they have, at that time anyway, they had altogether they were servicing 200 computers and 50 printers used by the Herald staff, by the newspaper staff. This is the newsroom. The tall guy in the background, Ken Robertson, is the executive editor. And anyway, this is early in the day, so there's not too many people in the office. In a morning newspaper in America, reporters can work whatever schedule they need, depending on what their job is. They might come in early, they might come in a little bit later. They're expected to put in, their 8 hours and then some probably, but they start at different times of the day depending on what stories they're working on and so forth. So this is early, not too many people in the newsroom yet. Anyway, it mentions here the reporters then write their stories in the computer and send them to the city desk or the metro desk to review the content mostly. The metro editor, the city editor might look at they might correct some grammar problems and stuff, but their main concern is the content. Did they ask the right questions? Did they talk to the right people? Have they biased the story in some ways? They're looking at the content more than the spelling and grammar. So we see here the managing editor, Rick Larson, was so he's directly underneath the executive editor that I showed you previously, Ken Robertson. And so he's handling the direct supervision of the city editor here, Lori Williams, and she in turn oversees the work of the local reporters, local news reporters, as I mentioned, as well as she kind of oversees the work of the photo editor. Obviously, directly oversees the work of his various photographers, but he kind of services all the different departments. So if they need something, they let the photo editor know they need a photographer to go someplace to take pictures and so forth. And that's the photo editor, Bob Brody, sitting down there. It mentions here that their department at that time was producing about 600 digital photos in a day, of which 20 to 30 were usually published. So that's one thing that I tell my students here at Kimep, is that to be a good photojournalist, one of the main things you do is just take lots of photos. I show them some of the photos that I had published, and I sometimes, ask them, how many, like if I went to a conference and I got some really good photos that I used in the newspaper, how many photos do you think I took to get this really good photo for the front page? And sometimes if I went to a multi-day conference, I might have taken 300 photos all by myself, and ended up using maybe 10 or 15 in the newspaper, including the very best would be on the front page. So that's my scheme of being a good photojournalist, is just take lots and lots of photos, and obviously think about what you're doing, getting close, and trying to figure out the right angles, try to get the right timing, try to find some active photos and so forth. So the number of photos they produce as compared to those that are actually used is about right. Probably mine is even less than, like I say, I might be closer to the 20 out of 600 pictures I take. I might use 20 in a publication. This is the graphics editor, and again, she services all the departments, but primarily the news desk. So she does charts and graphics of all sorts, maps, things like that. Whenever an editor thinks that her work could help tell the story, infographic basically, then she does that. One of the members of the copy desk, Bill Ward, was there for a long time. He's now retired. I still stay in communication with him via Facebook, but he's retired now. But again, the copy desk, as I mentioned, handles final editing. In other words, the spelling and grammar. Those in the copy desk do the headlining. They design the page. They electronically paginate the page. And their work, they usually come in around 4 o'clock and they work until after midnight. So my job was on the copy desk. I had various functions. I was, among other things, the late night editor, which meant I stayed to watch the newspaper get off the press while all the other editors went home and all the reporters were home. I stayed, and usually about 1:30 in the morning, they would be starting up their press and running the first copies of the newspaper. And my job was to make sure that there weren't any really embarrassing headlines or something that somebody, some mistake that somebody made, and give it the final okay. So I might go in a little bit later. I also tended to take a 2-hour lunch break in order to the fact that I wasn't leaving until after 1:30 from the work. I had other jobs, by the way. Like I said, night editor, the wire editor. Sometimes that's a totally separate job, of just to be the wire editor and watch the stories as they come in from Associated Press, from the New York Times News Service, from the LA Times News Service, Washington Post News Service. In a bigger newspaper, that would in fact, there might be multiple people doing that job, because the news services provide, even for a mid-sized daily like this, provide thousands of stories every day. And so as a wire editor, it is my job to try to sort through those thousands of stories, and the news services try to prioritize them to help an editor, a wire editor like myself, to figure out which was the most important. But still, it was a lot of work to make sure that the best of the stories got into the paper when you had limited space for them. Our priority was local news, and that's even more important nowadays because people can get national and international news all over the internet, but they don't necessarily get good local news coverage. So most newspapers find that the more local newspapers, the smaller local newspapers, are doing better than some of the big regional newspapers or national newspapers, because people are more dependent on those smaller newspapers for local news. So the big emphasis in newspapers now is to cover local news. Other jobs, I had special editions, special publications. Every year we did a series of what we call progress editions, and I was in charge of that sometimes. And anyway, different duties. I mentioned editorial. When we talk, the word editorial can be used in two different ways. It can be used in the sense of all the news in a newspaper is considered editorial content in one sense. Sometimes we refer to all the news, all of the printed news and opinion, the whole thing, everything we prepare for our consumers' information is considered the editorial content. But more specifically, at most newspapers, when we talk about editorial, we're talking about the editorial page. I mentioned before the opinion page. So for example, this is editorial page editor Kim Bradford, and her job was to write editorials on behalf of the local newspaper, the Tri-City Herald in this case, and to also kind of design and oversee. Usually there were, at least a lot of times, there were at least 2 pages made available for opinion. One reflecting the opinion of the local newspaper, and the other one called the op-ed page, the opposing editorial page. And that frequently had lots of letters to the editor. They had their own opinions, and maybe some columns from, like in this case, the Tri-City Herald was somewhat liberal in its editorial orientation, so they might have some conservative writers, either local conservative writers or pieces from news services, opinion pieces, that they might put on the op-ed page, the second page. And they'd have editorial cartoons and things like that too to help brighten it up a little bit. And then ultimately, as all these pages are produced electronically, then they get sent to the production area. The Herald, where I worked, was one of the first newspapers in the world, actually, that became fully paginated. They became fully paginated, where every page was completely done on computer before it was sent to the back shop, and that was achieved in 1994. Even much before that, the news content would be done electronically, but they would add the advertising and some other aspects later. So most of it was being electronically paginated by 1987 while I was there. But for them to say it was fully paginated did not occur until 1994. These are plate makers. They produce an aluminum plate that has the image of each page on it. And in the year 2000, they converted to what they call direct-to-plate. It used to be that even when we were, like in 1994, when we were fully paginated, it was still first became a negative, like a photo negative, and then the photo negative was placed on a plate, this aluminum plate, and a really bright, like a welding rod type bright light would be shown through the negative, and with the chemical covering of the aluminum plate, that image would be created on the aluminum plate, and so the aluminum plate would look like the page that was going to be printed ultimately, and indeed the ink would be attracted to the image on the aluminum plate, and that's how the page was printed. It wasn't actually raised lettering like it previously was, like a rubber stamp. It wasn't like that. It's not raised lettering, but it's had the image in a formed on the aluminum plate that still attracted the ink, kind of like a rubber stamp would, but not with the raised lettering. So the press is actually takes 3 stories in essence. You see that the top part, there's not too much in the top part, but I'll show you, this is a model of it, but this is actually 3 floors of the building were needed to accommodate the big presses that they used to print all the news pages and of the newspaper simultaneously. Sometimes with the real newspaper, they had to pre-print some stuff ahead of time and insert it into the newspaper later, but on a daily, most of the days except Sunday, they could print the entire newspaper all at one time. So this is the bottom floor. This is where the rolls of newspaper or newsprint are fed into the big presses. Each of the rolls, like a giant roll of toilet paper, but it's with newsprint. Each roll weighs about 1,000 pounds. In other words, half a ton. And so they need to have equipment to put them into place and hook them into the presses. And so they have these are rolls of paper that are all ready to go, so they can quickly during the run as they're printing each day, they will run out of, some of their presses will run out of paper. And so they'll need to very quickly roll one of these into place and hook up the paper, because they'll have to stop printing long enough to do that. So they try to facilitate it and have everything ready to go so that they don't have to stop the presses very long to put in a new roll of print. And the different presses run out of paper at different rates. So there are a number of different press units, and so they are having to stop and start occasionally throughout the night as they're printing the newspaper to put new rolls of paper into place. And so these are some that are still packaged. They haven't had the covers taken off yet. So you see a newspaper goes through so much, they in case for some reason they can't get a supply of paper, they need a big storage room like this to store many tons of newspaper, so that they for sure don't have a problem of not being able to print their newspaper because they don't have any paper. So this is their storage room. Now this would be the second level. We were looking at that 3-level print unit, and this is where the actual where the plates put the image of the onto the paper itself. So the paper comes up from the lowest level, comes up to this level, and the print units print both sides of each roll of paper. So the paper comes up and they're printing both sides of it simultaneously as it rolls through. This is called a web press because each press unit, well, I was going to say each has its own roll of paper. That's not necessarily true. Some press units in older models like this print only one color. So if you want to print color, a full color photo, it has to go through 4 different press units. But that roll of paper, they grab the end of it and it goes up, goes through a press unit, and if it's going to be color, it goes down and goes through another press unit and through another press unit and through another press unit to get all 4 colors for a full color photo. With modern presses, some of the modern presses are able to put full color on with 1 unit, which saves a lot of time and space and hassle. The press makes so much noise, it's like a freight train driving by. It's very loud. And so while they use ear protectors, kind of look something like headphones like this, they all wear ear protectors. They also have enclosed rooms like this where they're working with computers and stuff to try to, again, reduce the noise. Otherwise they're going to go deaf before they retire. This is a smaller press, but it helps to be able to see a smaller press. This one is also owned by the newspapers for smaller jobs that they do for other companies and other organizations. And so it's a little bit easier in this small press to see what's happening. So I took some pictures of this unit. So in this smaller press, you see the newsprint is coming up, it's going through this this press unit. You see in this up here it's being pulled through. It's being printed on both sides. On the left side is printing on one side of the newspaper, and then the newsprint on the other side is printing the other side simultaneously, and then that whole row comes up. In this case, you see this. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's this paper is just looks like yellow ink put on this sheet of the paper through in the first press, and then it's been going down and going through the second press, and it looks like that one's going to put blue on that in that press unit. So this is a full color publication whenever they're printing, and so it's going through, the paper is going through multiple press units to get the different colors. The colors in a 4-color operation like this are black, magenta is a reddish color, cyan is a bluish color, and yellow. So those are the different colors used to make full color in a print operation. So again, you're seeing the paper on the left is coming down from a prior unit, is going into this one for, it appears, getting the magenta color through this unit, and then going back up again. So it's like I said, it's called a web press because of the way it webs through the different print units. Once all the printing's done, again, it webs through these different press units and has more than just one roll of paper. There typically will have multiple rolls of paper going through different units, and they web together. And then I think the next slide, yeah, this is where it shows the paper all being pulled together. And this, oops, let me go backwards and went forwards by accident. And then it goes through a folder cutter. So this unit here is cutting the paper at the appropriate spots and then folding the paper to be what you would expect to see a newspaper look like. So it starts off in these rolls of paper, and it comes out all folded, printed, cut, and folded like you will see it on a newsstand. The press the larger press of the Herald will actually produce over 60,000 newspapers, complete newspapers, not pages, but complete newspapers an hour if they didn't have to stop it to put new paper in. And since they only need fewer than 50,000 copies, technically they could do it all in 1 hour, but since they have to stop to reload paper and stuff, it takes a little bit longer than that. So they get printing sometime between 1:30 and 2. They're ready to roll. They get the plates by about 12:30, and they're printing the newspaper by between 1:30 and 2. They start printing, and then it takes them another, like I say, hour and a half or so, because they have to change paper, hour and a half to 2 hours at most, to print all the papers and give them to the carriers. There's also another step here. This is the cut and folded newspapers. It's kind of in a dark area here, so it's hard to see. They're coming out from the press on a conveyor belt into an area where they might insert other pre-printed materials, pre-printed advertising or pre-printed other sections of the newspaper. If it's a big newspaper like a Sunday newspaper, they've pre-printed some of the sections already, and they're going into an area where those pre-printed portions can be inserted. And so this is, they have several different types. This is one type of inserter. They use some suction, like a vacuum cleaner suction, to open up the paper and then and automatically put in the pre-printed section into the middle of the folded newspaper. That's one type. Anyway, you see lots and lots of pre-printed material here. A lot of this is advertising. So an advertiser might print a 12-page advertisement or a flyer, whatever you want to call it, pre-printed material, and have the whole 12 pages inserted into the newspaper. And so they're paying for the insertion, not for the printing in that case, unless they have the Herald printed separately. But frequently a big company like Walmart or something would have their stuff pre-printed someplace else and then shipped into each of the individual newspapers, because they're all going to basically look alike in the various cities where they have stores. This is another type of inserter here. It goes in a circular pattern, but the same process. They have a vacuum suction to open up the paper and then automatically insert some pre-printed material into the newspaper. So they also have to have allocate, also since they want to be rolling out, they want to start distributing the newspaper around 4, they have to have time for this insertion process to take place also. So then everything's bundled up. They're thrown into these vans to be taken out to the different, all sorts of areas, out to the individual, as I mentioned, the young carriers that take them door to door. These vans would take them out and put them on the carrier's front step, and then the carrier would open up the bundle and start walking around the neighborhood and delivering them house to house. So it mentions they drop bundles at 353 locations in 8 counties, so they cover a very big area, and it takes them about 3.5 hours to do that. So that by itself is a major task. They have 9 district managers oversee 500 carrier routes, which, as I mentioned, 70% of them are kids, ages 10 to 17. Who want to make a few dollars delivering newspapers, every day. And so people like this have to recruit those kids and manage those kids. And you can imagine 10-year-old kids sometimes aren't very reliable. And so that by itself is a major task. And then they're going to recycle a lot of paper when they're done. It takes a while for the press to make sure that all the colors line up, that everything's being cut right, and so they go through, they probably run newspapers for about 15 minutes that they expect not to be distributed. And during those 15 minutes, they're trying to line everything up, make sure everything's looking okay, that the like I mentioned, the colors have to line up properly, or it's going to look fuzzy. It's going to look out of like it's a blur. And so, especially if you're printing full color, you have to make sure all the colors are lining up properly. So they end up wasting a lot of newsprint in the process. Okay, so that's your tour of a daily newspaper in America. I imagine the daily newspapers in Korea are about the same, but you may have not had the opportunity to take a tour of a newspaper and realize just how complicated it is. I've taken a tour of the New York Times, and it's it puts out 900,000 newspapers every day. This newspaper puts out, about 45,000. So you're talking about, what would that be? 900,000, 45,000 would go into that 20 times. So, the New York Times operation is 20 times bigger than this operation that I showed you. I've been in the New York Times, their press room while they were printing. They have to have lots and lots of presses. They can't, as I mentioned, a big press, a really good press, can put out maybe 70,000 in an hour. Well, if you're printing 900,000 newspapers, you need lots of presses. You need to get that job done quickly enough that they can deliver those papers to the readers on a timely basis. So, in their press room, they have, I don't know, at least what would that be? They'd have to have something close to 20 different presses, like the press you saw with the Tri-City Herald. The New York Times would have 20 of those. So their press room is huge, much more complicated than what you see here. Okay, well, we still don't see Frederick here. Let me check my email and just see if he responded to my email. I hope nothing's wrong. I emailed him when we first got started in case he just forgot about us or something, but he has not responded to my email either. So I'm not sure what to think is going on there. So I'm going to proceed. In fact, I think what I will do, well, let me check what presentations I've already uploaded. I wasn't expecting to be the main presenter today. So maybe what we'll do is take a break, a 10-minute break, and that'll give me time to kind of get organized here. Since I wasn't expecting to do this, I'll quickly decide what else I want to show you today, and then in 10 minutes we'll pick it up again. So let's take a 10-minute break, and it's 9:19 by Michael. Well, it's 19 after the hour. So let's start at 30 after that, half past the hour, okay? Well, I still have things I want to cover and that I have not had a chance to cover elsewhere. So I will, we might finish early, but let's go ahead and take a break now, and then we'll pick it up from there.
Okay, so because of the delay, I'm not sure if I'll have time to get through both Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 today, so I've altered my slides slightly and divided the things. I suspect what I'll end up doing is covering Chapter 7 along with Chapter 9, which makes logical sense to have radio and television together as broadcasting. So if we have to do that, that's the way I'd like to handle it. But we'll see how things go with, excuse me, today with, today with music. All right. Here we go. Okay, Chapter 6, music. Let me actually, before we get right to this slide, think of music before the innovations of sound recording, before broadcast, before electronic communication. If people wanted to enjoy music prior to any of these innovations, they had to enjoy it live. And that meant either performing yourself or being present with somebody else who was performing music. It was much more common in the early prior to broadcasting for people in families to entertain themselves with singing, perhaps with musical performance if somebody was wealthy enough to own a musical instrument. Entertainment was something that people generated for themselves rather than something, or in common with other people, rather than something that they bought on a shelf or listened to through some electronic medium. So music, our relationship with music culturally was very different prior to the advent of mass media. I also want to remind you, I'm going to bring us back very frequently to Clay Shirky and his discussion of media. What we're talking about today in music, we'll be talking about recorded technologies, some of which, from his perspective, are technologies that are good for creating groups. They're good for creating groups because they allow somebody to reproduce a single message many times over and share it with groups of people. Okay. I'd also like to say we focus quite a bit. We focus quite a bit when we talk about mass media on technologies, and technologies are essential. They're a key part of mass media, but technologies aren't the only driving force. Technologies aren't the only thing that matter when we're talking about mass communication. So as I go through the presentation today, please keep in mind that there are, I've used the word innovations. Instead of inventions, I've used the word innovations in the presentation today. And when I say innovations, I mean practices, things that are developed that are new, new ways of doing things, and those are not just what we call inventions or technologies. They're ways of doing things. Now, remember, we've been talking about culture as shared lived experience, ways of knowing, ways of understanding, ways of doing things. And the important innovations that have come in the era of mass communication, the important communication innovations, are not just innovations of technology. They're also innovations of practices that come through our engagement with technology, as people try to communicate through technologies and try to get, one way of looking at it is if you consider the theory of uses and gratifications, one way of looking at it is the way that people are trying to get what they need through their use of technology. Now, I wouldn't use the term myself, uses and gratifications, in a blanket sense, as always the best way for understanding this. But if you remind yourself of the assumptions of uses and gratifications theory, it does help to and the assumption the assumption is that people use technologies, they use media to fulfill some needs that they have. They also change media. When there are what we call disruptive uses of media, there are uses of media that aren't the uses that we were expected to make of things. This is part of our engagement with media, and it has very much to do with the development of communication. It's another sign, another way that people are strong in the relationship with media. Our media theories, one way of breaking down the media theories, dividing them, is to consider some theories like direct effects assume that users or audiences are weak, and that communication technologies and the people who use them are strong, are powerful in the relationship with the audience. But there are other theories, like uses and gratifications, like two-step theory, that say no, it doesn't work that way. Audiences, users are strong. They make choices. They manipulate technologies to the best of their ability to make the technologies provide them with what they think they want to have. So keep that in mind as we go through this. Okay, so early innovations in sound recording. Thomas Edison, for Americans, Thomas Edison is a very familiar name. Thomas Edison was an inventor. He held patents in areas including recorded music. He held patents with lighting. He held, every once in a while I'm reading something and I hear of some other kind of invention, some area of patent that Edison was working on. He held some patents. He must have been a tremendously interesting person. He was tremendously inventive, and he was also very well oriented toward business. Like many inventors, he wasn't just inventing things, processes for doing things, although that was part of what he did. He was also a businessman who was finding ways to finding ways to hold patents to capture the property rights over certain kinds of innovations. And in his life, he was involved with several different high-profile cases of competition with other inventors over processes and patents and that sort of thing. I won't go into great detail on that. Edison in 1877, this was 15 years after the end of the American Civil War, Edison invented what we call now the phonograph, a recorded sound on a cylindrical record. He made a cylinder, and you can see it here in this photo, a cylinder which could be rotated, and the cylinder had grooves on it, onto which the sound was recorded by etching the sound, etching grooves that moved a needle. Not explaining that very well for our purposes. We don't need to know so much the technology. Now, you could take then a cylinder that had been recorded, remove it from a device, pass it along to another device, and that device could play it. This was a huge innovation. It meant that for the first time, in practical terms, there were slightly earlier forms of recording, but this is the first commercially viable form of recording sound on a cylinder for mass production. This is the first mass production of recorded sound. As often happens, one innovator picks up on another innovator's ideas. In 1887, 10 years later, Emil Berliner invented the gramophone. Now this was taking Edison's innovation of using grooves on a hard surface to record sound, except that he put it onto a flat disc. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with LP records, the ones that were very popular until the end of the 20th century. But this was essentially the gramophone that Berliner invented, was essentially that same disc that dominated music for more than 100 years. Initially, the flat discs that he designed were made out of a hard material that was brittle. We'll talk about another innovation in a few minutes about that, but he made it a flat disc, which made it much more practical to transfer, to ship, to store. So it was a huge innovation. It was cheaper to produce these discs than cylinders, easier to produce them, and once they were produced, they were easier to ship, to store. So this was a big change, very important innovation. Berliner in 1895. Now he was also somebody thinking very much about business. He wasn't somebody who was just inventing things for the sake of doing something new, for seeing how something worked, but he wanted to get the financial benefits of the things that he was creating. He established the Berliner Gramophone Company in 1895. Now this gramophone company, he was recruiting opera stars to record discs. Opera in this era, opera was the popular music of the era. The dominant way of sharing music, of commercially selling music at this time, was through sheet music. Now you'll see in this photo of the person singing into essentially the speaker for the gramophone. You'll see there's sheet music sitting on a stand. At this point, the industry for sheet music was very well developed. There were publishers who were producing sheet music, and sheet music was something that was very valuable to people. When they didn't have records, they performed music themselves. The only way to keep up with new music forms was either to attend at performances or to learn music through sheet music, and to perform off of sheet music. There was a huge industry in sheet music, and actually this industry was actually dominant for quite some time, even after the advent of recorded music. It took it took a good 20 years before before recorded music caught up with sheet music in terms of sales. Tin Pan Alley. This was a neighborhood in New York City. Tin Pan Alley was, and I don't remember exactly what streets, where it is at this point, but the photo that I have here, I located an old photo of a street front operation in Tin Pan Alley. In music culture, at least into the 1970s, 1980s, the idea, Tin Pan Alley was important in the minds of many people involved in music. With the advent of with the advent of, in the era of the advent of recorded music, Tin Pan Alley was the industrial, you could think of it as the industrial center for the production of commercial music at that time. It was a neighborhood, an area where music publishers set up businesses, and they collaborated in this neighborhood. They collaborated with performers, composers, to produce new popular music. They weren't producing classical music. They weren't producing music that was supposed to be high art. They were producing music for sale. They were trying to feed the demand for popular music. They would come up with formulas. They would follow trends and try to produce as quickly as possible first sheet music, but then forming compositions. And the name Tin Pan Alley, as I've heard it, the name Tin Pan Alley comes from the sound that was generated, because each of these places served as a little studio where musicians would come in and play as they composed. And the sound out on the street, people described as hearing people inside these buildings banging on tin pans. The importance here is the development of popular music as a commodity, as something that can be sold in large quantities to large groups of people. Tin Pan Alley was a very important, culturally and historically in the United States, a very important part of that. Okay, some other kinds of innovations. Around this time, there were some changes made to copyright law. Copyright law in the United States was initially developed and has its basis in the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution of the United States says that in order to ensure, now I'm not going to quote directly, and Ken may be able to quote this verbatim actually, because I believe he has a degree in constitutional law. But essentially what the Constitution says about copyright law is that in order to ensure the production of ideas and innovations, that the government has the right to set, for limited times, allow authors exclusive rights to their creative works. Think of it this way. If I write a song, if I compose a song, create some sheet music, it's possible for somebody else just to take that sheet music and reproduce it. They can reproduce it either by making copies of the sheet music and selling that sheet music, or they can reproduce it by performing from that sheet music. Now, the changes in the copyright law at this time that were to help protect the developing music industry were changes that allowed for composers and publishers of music to collect fees related to performance of their music. Now, performance became, with recorded music, performance became something that could be reproduced in large quantities and sold to large markets. The changes in the copyright law in this era recognized that and helped to protect publishers, sometimes composers, but mostly publishers, because publishers usually were the people with the ability to challenge things in court, protected their rights so that other people wouldn't simply take their work and sell it. So copyright law changed, and there was development of license fees, so that the music industry, and this is, we'll talk a little bit about radio in the music section, can't be helped, but essentially in the early days of radio, what was happening was radio broadcasters needed to have things to broadcast. They knew that people enjoyed music, and so they were broadcasting either live music or recorded music on the radio. And when this initially started happening, the industry, the radio industry, didn't pay anything for that. At least they didn't pay anything to composers. They might pay performers. They may pay performers to come in and either perform live on the radio or perform, record something which could be played repeatedly on the radio. So there were big changes going on at this time that in some ways are difficult, I think. When we think about the development of mass media, it's sometimes difficult to think about the kinds of things we take for granted now, the kinds of things we assume when we're dealing with communication. At some point in the past, those were brand new and they were being worked out. Imagine now, those of you, I'm not even sure how many of you are old enough to remember the disruption caused by MP3 files and file transfer. This was just as big as that. So. There were cultural shifts involved with these changes. Sheet music had provided consumers with the opportunity to buy music to play at home, or and sometimes this would be for home performance. Sometimes it would be for professional performance. If a person was a musician, they may make their living going to public places and playing music. They bought sheet music in order to keep up with the latest music and have an authoritative guide to how to play that particular piece. Physical audio recordings provided consumers with the opportunity to buy copies of performances that were performed by known stars or by otherwise by accomplished performers. Now this is a big change. Imagine if your primary form of listening to music is listening to someone in your family play that music. The person may be a very good musician, they may not be a very good musician, but for most people, the person in your family may not be a great musician. Physical audio recordings made it much easier for people to listen to the great performers. If we consider there's only one Pavarotti, if Pavarotti can't be in all places at all times, if you want to listen to Pavarotti in an environment in which we don't have physical or broadcast audio recordings, you may have some trouble doing that. But if you live in an environment in which there are audio recordings, we have a much greater opportunity to listen to the most accomplished performers. This was a huge change. Broadcast audio recordings also allowed consumers, broadcast lowered costs because people, now if you were buying a phonograph, a gramophone, you had to buy the machine, the gramophone itself, and then you had to buy discs, which were not cheap. If you listen to music on the radio, you may have less control over what you're listening to. But once you buy the radio, in the United States, broadcast models never came I know in some countries, Britain, one of the noteworthy ones, in some countries there's a tax on broadcast that comes along when you buy a radio or television. The United States never did that. You bought your radio, and you had your radio, and you could just listen. And the payment was made. Eventually, the model that was worked out was payment through advertising. So the advent of broadcasting allowed for distribution of audio recordings with much more variety and even lower cost than the physical audio recordings of gramophone. So these are big cultural shifts that are happening. I know I'm describing them as changes related to technology, but what they are changes. They're changes in our relationship to families, our relationship to music, our relationship to the people who play music. These are big cultural changes. Music becomes, with the development of these innovations, music becomes something that's no longer necessarily part of a face-to-face no longer part of a face-to-face relationship. With sheet music, music becomes something that can be transferred from place to place and person to person, and so long as you have a person with the skills and the tools to reproduce what's on the sheet music, that can be shared. Right? So in other words, the people with the skills and the tools to reproduce what's on the sheet become part of our communication system that helps us capture, understand, and experience the music that's described in the sheet music. Physical audio recordings bring us that much closer to the experience of what we would have experienced face to face, but now we can do it in a disembodied form instead of me traveling to see Pavarotti or me waiting until Pavarotti comes to my city to perform. I can simply go to a record store, buy a disc of Pavarotti, and listen to it. It's a huge, huge change. The 2000 film, Brother, Where Art Thou? I don't know if any of you have seen this one, but there is there's a sub-theme running through this film related to, particularly to radio, and the recording of sound and how people used that. So there's a scene in the film where a group of people come to an isolated radio station, and they need some money. There's a guy with them who plays guitar, and they get an offer from the station owner to sing into a microphone, so that their voices can be recorded. They do that, the station owner pays them, and then he starts playing music, playing their song over and over again on his radio station. Now, again, we're getting into radio, not just recorded music, but that's kind of necessary at this point. Early radio, a lot of the popularity of early radio was based on music. It was a form of entertainment, and there wasn't enough music recorded at the time that early radio developed to fill the airwaves. They were looking for things, so radio stations were looking for ways to produce what we now call content programming. So in the film, a thing that I really like about this film is this sub-theme, this group of people, one of whom is actually a musician, plays a guitar, and the rest of them just sing. They don't have any particular training. And they get their $10 or whatever they were paid, and then they go on with what they were doing. And without knowing it was happening, they develop a fan base because the radio station is playing this recorded music, and the radio station distributes it to other stations, and they're playing it. And suddenly this band, the Soggy Bottom Boys, which didn't really exist except at that moment when they did the performance, suddenly this band is famous. And there's a scene later on in the film when these men who did the singing are surprised to find people know who they are, people are familiar with their voices, and they're fans. They love them. Right? It's a commentary on the impact of recorded music and on broadcast music. A commentary on how significant that change was. It wasn't possible prior to the advent of recorded music for someone to listen to someone's performance unless they were in the same place with them. It wouldn't have been possible for somebody to develop a big fan base without knowing they were doing it. And yet once radio and recorded music came about, it became quite possible for that to happen. Radio was also, there's another character in this film called Pappy O'Daniel. He's a politician, and in the film he's a politician who senses the importance of recordings and broadcast, and uses them to reach the public. It's a commentary on, in this film, a commentary on how the advent of recorded sound and broadcast sound changed the relationship between the state and its representatives and people at large. No longer was it necessary for people to be convened, brought together as publics. It was no longer necessary for people to be face-to-face in order to do that. Now this is, remember, Clay Shirky, bringing it back again to Clay Shirky. Clay Shirky talks about media as being good for convening groups, bringing together, forming groups of people. Prior to the advent of mass media, the only way to convene groups is actually to bring people together face to face in some way. With mass media, with mass reproduction of texts, written texts, or in this case with mass reproduction of recorded sound, it's possible to bring, in a sense, to bring together groups by exposing them to the same information, by distributing information, ideas widely to groups of people. Those groups of people begin they're exposed to similar information, and they begin to conceive themselves as part of common groups, part of the same group, even when they may not necessarily have direct contact with other people in those groups.
And Frederick is in Toronto. Our students are in Korea. So this is exactly the program I would be using.
This, I told you on the previous slide we were looking at somebody named Pappy O'Daniel. This is the real Pappy O'Daniel, the person whose name the character of the film is taken from. Governor W. Lee Pappy O'Daniel. He was a conservative Democratic governor from Texas. And he rose to prominence with use of radio. Radio relies on recorded sound in many instances, so I'm treating them together here, at least for the moment. But these are significant changes. Right? Part of the cultural shift has to do, it's not just the changes in the culture of music and commercialization of music. That's huge. But also changes in political life, in the way that our leaders communicate with us.
We can do the desktop, and we might want to just try it once just to make sure we're satisfied with the speed. Lately, its transition has been about the same as PowerPoint.
This slide, I think this is an important slide. If you look at
5 years ago,
sales of radios in 1922, see, there's a slide that'll come up a little later that tells us numbers of radio stations, which is also big. Radio's just beginning in the early 1920s, just beginning commercial radio really to take hold. So if you look at the numbers of radios that are sold in the United States in the 1920s, it's just growing very quickly.
it all goes through their central system. So
In 1921, there were 5 radio stations, commercial radio stations in the United States. In 1927, there were 600. This was a huge innovation, a huge change that was
Arizona and back again. So when you see
had an enormous impact in the United States.
back again. And so in theory, they're going to see it, if they have the same broadband you do, they'll see it about the same time you do. Because they're both signals are going to come.
We've got some other innovations that I want to talk about a bit. These are, and certainly not all the innovations, these are just a few that are significant. The reel-to-reel tape recorder, if you've ever seen, now I didn't get a picture of this one, but when I was growing up, my family had picture 2 large, how do I do this out right here? 2 large round discs. So there was a plastic disc, 2 plastic discs about this size, and they were separated so that tape was looped around one of the discs, and they would turn and the tape would go through a reader. The tape was metallic, and the tape recorder had a magnetic device that could read sound or record. Actually, it could record sound onto the tape, and it could also read sound off the tape. And this is a very important innovation because it allowed people not just to listen, not just to buy records and listen to them. It allowed them a relatively inexpensive way to start recording sound themselves. And I remember quite vividly when I was growing up, I used to like to record radio programs. I would make my own radio shows on this reel-to-reel tape recorder that my parents had. I would pull out a box that had a tape in it and roll it in, put it into the tape machine, turn it to record, hold the microphone, and make my radio show. And I remember quite a conflict I had with my mother at one point when I made a recording over one of her favorite albums, recorded albums, which my parents had bought on tape, so it was possible to do that as well. So reel-to-reel recording. What reel-to-reel recording did is it made it possible without a huge investment of money. It was the first form of audio recording, producing a recording that was affordable enough for consumers, middle-class consumers, to buy so that they could make their own recordings. Of course, there are other forms of recording as well. The cassette tapes, you may be familiar with the tapes that are about this big and they have 2 discs inside and the tape goes through. That was a later innovation that developed from the same technology and made that recording technology that much more inexpensive and convenient. A much better way than using discs for producing sound. And in fact, the recording industry went to using very quickly the recording industry as a whole went to using tape as a medium for recording rather than discs, because it gave them far more options in terms of post-production, manipulating the recording, combining sounds. Another innovation was the development of vinyl records. The early gramophone recordings were made from a hard material that was brittle, could break easily, wasn't durable. Vinyl, when vinyl came, it was much more durable, much less prone to breakage, and much easier to produce, to mass produce. So it lowered the cost of records, and it made them last longer. So this was quite good for consumers. Another innovation. Actually, I like this example. The single track recording. Initially reel-to-reel recorders were single track recorders. They didn't record 2 channels in stereo, or now they're more sophisticated 4 16-track recording devices now. Early reel-to-reel recorders only recorded a single track. Now, sometimes a limitation in a technology can be something that inspires innovation in the right hands. In this case, a guitarist, a very famous guitarist named Les Paul, he's famous not just for his music and his performances. He's also famous for his innovations. He designed an electric guitar in order to get the right kind of sound that he wanted in making his music. So he was an innovator, an inventor, not just a musician. So he wasn't satisfied with recording just the typical recording would be in a monorail recording would be, okay, if you want to have a recording made, you set up a microphone and you bring together all the people who are going to be part of the recording and they play. He came up with an innovation, which was to record something, then take that recording and play live at the same time that you play the recording. and record those things together. That way he could use the capabilities of the recorded music multiple times in order to create layers within the music. So if he wanted to perform 2 different guitar tracks in the same composition, he himself, he could do that. This is an example of how people can innovate using the limitations of technology. Technology can't do everything. It may seem to some of us like magic, but it's not. I'm sorry, I see lots of not available there. Are there people out there now? Send me a message, please.
It's a way of skipping to different slides, not in sequence. So if you leave it on, you'll see essentially all the slides at once on the left side. But on the bottom toolbar, you can turn that on or off. If it bothers you, like it bothers me, I turn it off. I don't use it. But if you thought you might be jumping back and forth, then you would leave it on. You don't have to go in sequence. So yeah, whenever you want to get together, like I say, he'll be done here in half an hour or so. And by the way, it is a record. I'm recording our session, so I can. One of the students isn't there, so I'll send them a link to the recording. I'll upload it to our Kimep.tv site, so they can go to our site and since they're not native English speakers, all of them go watch it again if they want to. But particularly the ones absent.
Okay, now I see online.
Actually, I created it, so I've got, it's actually, I'm paying for the website at this point, so we're at some point I'll transfer it over to Kimep.
Okay, here's another example. This is our own personal example of the limitations of technology. I was talking and talking for a while here. I see my face. I see my presentation screen, and I see a list of names on my screen, and they had all gone gray. And at the bottom of the screen, at the bottom of the list of names, it said not available. So I was not sure that anybody could hear me. I thought maybe I was just talking to myself. So as an aside, I'll say for me, that's an example of the need to adapt to technology and recognizing the different environment in which this technology puts me. So, sorry. Okay. So Les Paul, the key thing here for me, Les Paul was an innovator who innovated with technologies, but also despite the limitations of technologies. He wanted to achieve certain things, and even when the technology wasn't really set up to do it, he figured out a way to make the technology work to do what he needed. All right, the next innovation, multi-track recording. Multi-track recording allowed people who weren't as clever, who weren't as imaginative as Les Paul to do what he was doing. Multi-track recording, meaning you could record many people separately, and this is the way most music recording happens now. Most professional music recording happens. A band will develop a song, and when you get to the stage of recording, there may be some things that are recorded with people playing together, but most of the recording happens in a studio with individual people playing a piece, playing their part of the piece. That's recorded, and then engineers come and put the sound all together. They listen to it, they change the tracks as they go together. So commercial recorded music is very different from live performance because of this. Commercial recorded music is a joint production between musicians and technicians, engineers, who will all work together to take the sounds and assemble them into a final product that's as perfect as it can be. There are some musicians who push against this, who really prefer to record their music like a live performance, but they're few and far between.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. There's going to be something else that pops in my mind there.
Another innovation. Now this is sort of an economic innovation. After World War II in the United States, there was a period, and some of this happened after World War I, but particularly after World War II, there were economic booms that meant most people had more money, but the key thing was that kids, young people, started to have money in a way that they hadn't in prior generations. In a society developing mass markets of consumer goods, it's important to recognize who has money, who has buying power. Young people, particularly after World War II, young people in the United States had a combination of money to spend, little responsibility for what they spend that on. In other words, it's what we call discretionary spending. When young people had money, they didn't have responsibilities usually like putting food on the family table. Many young people had money, but their parents paid for everything that they actually needed: clothing, food, schooling, those sorts of things. So the money that kids had was discretionary spending. And the other thing that kids generally had in this era was leisure time. In post-World War II, kids in the United States, at least up to about age 18 or so, they would go to school, and the school schedule would leave them time. Teenagers developed as a target market because of this. There was, when people have money to spend, they become good potential consumers. And so the music industry, in developing music trends, many of the popular music trends are aimed at young people, and a lot of the important music trends in the United States. And young people have, since World War II, young people have generally been the primary market for music. Also for other forms of recorded entertainment, but they're the biggest buyers, and they're the ones that the music industry aims to reach more than other groups of people. The book talks about a few cultural trends that affect music, and these are and vice versa, music affecting culture. These are very important. One of them is migration, and particularly in the discussion in the book, the migration of the African American population from the U.S. South after World War II in the United States. There was a big shift away from agrarian production to concentrated or dispersed in the countryside to production concentrated in the cities, factory production, that sort of thing, and concentrated in the cities of mostly of the northern U.S. And what this meant was this helped to inspire quite a significant migration of African American people who had been living in the rural South at this time, and many of them left the South and went to cities in the North. They went to Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, New York. Many went to California as well, but there's a map in our text that's pretty good that shows where everybody was headed. Now, why is this important for music? This had a big impact on music because these people coming from the South, where in cultural terms, they had been really isolated from the mainstream of U.S. culture when they were in the rural South. When African American communities started moving to city centers in the culture, what we could call the cultural core of the United States, although that, I suppose that could, using that term could cause arguments with people, but I guess the cultural core, because they were the cities where communications were concentrated. When people came to the cities, they brought with them their culture, their way of doing things, their way of eating, and for the purposes of what we're talking about today, they brought with them music. And the music that they brought was distinctive, it was different. For many people it was interesting, for some people it was dangerous. And it had a big impact on the music industry. In particularly the early 1950s was an era, the development of rock and roll. Rock and roll was an adaptation of Southern style blues. Brought into the commercial music culture, and it was picked up by performers. Sometimes there were African American performers who were brought into music industries. Early on, actually, probably more often, there were white performers who heard the sounds that were coming from the people who migrated from the South and adapted those sounds to their own music, and that had a huge impact on the music industry. Youth culture, that was another cultural trend, not just music, but other things that were of interest to youth became cultural trends. If any of you are familiar with the music of the 1960s, mid to late 1960s, early 1970s, a lot of the bands that were popular in this era were bands that were picking up on the political currents in the United States and in other countries in this time. Protest of the Vietnam War, liberalized sexuality and drug use among youth. These were all things that had an impact on developing music markets. Racial integration. Now, this is related to in some ways to migration, but racial integration. There was a lot of mixing of musical styles, and some of that mixing had to do with bringing together and accepting of cultural forms that came out of the African American experience. There was also another dynamic where people in the music industry, white performers, would basically hijack the music that was produced by black composers or black performers. It was not uncommon for a song to be done by a black performer and then for a white performer to come along and do the same song again, perhaps in the exact same style, and the song would become a hit when the white performer did it. So this was one of the things that was emblematic of the music industry. That was very strong in the 1950s and 1960s particularly. Other cultural trends, changing morality, risk-taking styles. Now there's some overlap here. For example, when I talk about youth culture and drug use and sexuality, that could also be discussed as changing morality. Now, you can look at musical styles across eras, look at what bands are popular, what are they singing about, what do they look like, and you can look at them and see certain kinds of trends occurring. Okay, am I right? Do we have? I'll keep talking, but if someone will answer that. Last thing here, I think this is actually the last part of what we're talking, it's almost last. Major record labels. The music industry in the United States was dominated by a relatively small number of major music labels. Now we talked, okay, I'll finish up here. We talked earlier on about how there's move toward concentration of industries. The tendency in the music industry for fewer and fewer music labels to dominate is typical of communication industries. It's what we call an oligopoly, where a few firms dominate the market. I'll skip over in the interests of getting done in a moment. Here's in 2010 the distribution of the share of market share in terms of volume of sales. Sony has 22% of the market. Universal has 35%. Warner has 21. A few companies in the commercial music market, a few companies dominate and sell most of the music. What this means is for many people, there's a sense that there's relatively little variety. And some people, for this reason, they look for independent music stores, independent music labels that have very small market shares, but are producing creative and innovative sorts of music. Some other innovations. These are actually quite important. I'm sorry I don't have time right now to go into them in detail. Maybe we'll get to do so later. But the development of MP3 files was a huge innovation. It allowed for digitization of music in a form that was high quality, low size, so that music could be transferred online easily. And this enabled the establishment of peer-to-peer networks for distributed file transfer. I see that we're out of time now, so I'll find a way to go over these next couple of slides. Well, actually, this is one last slide. I'll go through it when we meet again, because I'm sure you have another class to get to. Please. Good. Okay. Great. So that was covered in the student presentation. Okay. If you have any questions, please let me know. You can let me know in the channel right now, or send me an email, or I'll check the Facebook group. I'm sorry we didn't get to do Chapter 7 today because I was late. Apologies for that again. I will cover that probably in 2 weeks when I do television. So we'll do radio and television together, and I believe next week is movies, and it actually makes more sense to do movies first rather than broadcasting, and do broadcasting together. So we'll do it that way. So I thank you all very much, and Ken, anything to say before we sign off? Okay, thanks everybody. See you next week.